Welcome back to the Content Matters podcast. This is episode 2 of season 4, and I told you we were going to have some great guests joining us this season. I definitely wasn't lying. Today, we're going to spend some time talking about the importance of the employee digital experience with Chantelle Nash. Chantelle has over 10 years of experience in global learning and development and HR technology. She's worked in everything from design and development of the programs, communications, digital marketing, data and analytics, social learning, and community management. And currently, she is the Learning Systems and Innovation Leader at Baker Hughes, but she's also done some really fascinating work for GE that we're going to talk a little bit about today, too. So welcome, Chantelle.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Great. I think, let's just dive right into the first question because I think it's a really big one. How are companies addressing the learning and development of their employees today, and why does it need to evolve?
Well, I think the past few years have really told the story well on that. Not all, but a large number of companies still do not have a mature digital learning strategy. So many of them are just starting to get there, not only due to COVID, but also the war on talent now. So I had been working remotely for 9 years or so before COVID in the digital learning space, and everything we did was centered around how could we make learning more than just an event. So most people think of their really valuable training or learning, so to speak, as like the face-to-face stuff.
Yeah.
But of course, that's very important, but it's not everything. And in fact, I would say what's happening, before, during, and after is just as important, because, we don't retain everything that we learn in the moment. But that's also just not how we solve all of our problems. I mean, think about your daily lives. I don't need to take a training to become a mechanic to find out how to reset the breaker in my car because my radio is glitching out. I can quickly find a resource on the internet to help me do that. And that has happened before. That's why I had that example.
Yeah.
I thought I was going to have to take it into the shop, and I was like, let me just do some research. So the question is, again, what's happening before? What other mechanisms are you putting within a learning event to help support that, aside from just the actual instruction? And then also what's happening after? And I also think for the learning industry, the deliverable is twofold. So it's what can we do? How can we teach people how to be resourceful in those ways and be agile problem solvers? And how we do teach people that also needs to be more contemporary in itself. It needs to be more on demand. It needs to be more personalized to the moment of need, and so on.
It's definitely different than what it used to be. That's for sure.
Yeah.
So you've been fortunate to kind of drive this evolution of employee digital experience. You called it the consumer type approach to learning and development. What are some of the things that you've done, and how have they improved the experience?
Yeah. So treating L&D initiatives like any other product and thinking of things like how can it scale? How can it be more engaging? How can we measure it differently? How do we make sure it keeps evolving with, the pace of change? And from the back office side of things, how do we make sure that we're efficient? How do we make certain activities repeatable? So introducing automation into our work processes. How are we improving our processes overall and governing ourselves so we don't get into a pickle later on? So just kind of thinking more holistically. And these are not new concepts. Since I have a background in communications and a level of digital design from my instructional design days, things like positioning, branding, marketing are all things I started to kind of naturally see connections with and introduce to team members who may have been more on the technical side.
Mm-hmm.
And it was equally important to me then that I learned to understand some of the best practices on what makes sense on the development side. So, where do you begin to plan, and where does it make sense to do which things? And then that's when I started to learn more about user research and data and analytics, and how scoping and prioritization and implementation of features works for developers. So in essence, I kind of say it's like treating almost every project and product like its own business. So you need to plan, why are you doing this? Who is your audience? How are you going to execute? What are your measures of success? And having expertise in what's most impactful for all of those areas will help you better strategize as a whole. And that doesn't mean that you can't experiment and do things quickly. You have to take a long time to think through everything.
Right.
But even when you do a quick experiment, if you're not looking at the results from that holistic perspective, you're probably missing a piece of the puzzle.
Do you find that a lot of it sounds like that sounds like new stuff, new way of thinking, new way of doing things. That's not something that a lot of organizations are doing, or do you think from your what you're seeing that that's happening more often now?
I mean, it definitely varies. There are a lot of emerging companies that I do think are kind of naturally thinking that way. I think a lot of your established organizations do still struggle with it a little bit. There are still a lot of silos, and it's just it's difficult for people to kind of get out of that box of thinking. I mean, our society is set up that way, right? You
Yeah,
go to college and you major in one thing, and so I think overall it just takes a little bit more breaking out of the frameworks that we have in our heads, and just being more collaborative in general. I mean, I know that's a word like everybody just throws around that word, but what does that really mean? How can you really like
yeah,
truly work with somebody in an ingrained way?
yeah. Bringing the idea of bringing all of those different siloed departments together, technology, learning and development, digital marketing, communications, the marketing team, like it just sounds like it would be complicated that, they are, like you said, they're all kind of in their individual boxes. And
Yeah.
how do you chain all those things together?
So I found it's important. We know L&D efforts have like great technology and communication support in a certain organization, but that doesn't mean that those functions are aligned. So I found two things to be really helpful, even if you're currently working with groups today. One is it's important to partner with your cross-functional groups as early as possible. So both to share what you're hoping to accomplish, kind of where you have challenges, but also ask them for their ideas and start to make them shareholders of your L&D initiative. So just make it as another type of campaign that maybe they would do for communications instead of something that's kind of on the side. The second thing that helps, I think, is if you know absolutely nothing about the functional areas you need to support, try to at least learn the basics. Because have you ever had somebody, as an example, come to you, ask for something that they thought was totally simple, but they just weren't aware of how much effort it took to do that, or how many interdependencies that there were? So
Yeah.
it's the same thing when you're going to your cross-functional groups. So if you want to promote something to the organization and you need comms help, you can easily Google how to make a comms plan and just kind of see what elements go into that and start thinking through a little bit of that before you go to them. Because bringing that knowledge to the table can just help give you a little bit more credibility. It can get them more interested in working with you. And, there's no shame in coming to the table and to a conversation, not knowing. And, obviously it's important to say, hey, I don't know. Right.
Yep.
But if you start to pick up on some of these things as you start working with them, instead of just thinking like, well, this is their area and this is mine, and it'll help you as a professional later on. So this is basically the concept of skill stacking, which I love because I just feel like that's how I have come together as a human.
I think
So
I'm the same way, for sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
and a lot of people are. There's actually there's a great TED talk. I can't remember the exact title of it, but it's like something about multi-potentialites. I can send the link if you want to link to it later.
Sure.
In the notes or something, but it talks about how, again, going back to the concept of people who want to do more than one thing, that they're not an expert in one. And it's kind of similar to skill stacking. So instead of becoming an expert in one area, you build competence in multiple areas. So they work together in a unique way. So I saw a reference in an article that said we should aim to be in the top 25% in 3 to 4 skills, 3 to 4 things, to kind of like take advantage of that concept. I have one specific example of this from today, just actually. We were partnering with our speaking communications, to determine how we can optimize some of the learning notifications coming from our actual learning system. So these aren't things that are coming directly from a person or our comms group. And they were able to propose a design, but the trick is we need to use HTML to code this template into our system. And that system has a character limit. So the proposed design was well over that limit, more than double over the limit. But luckily, yours truly knows HTML. So I can look at the design, I can go back into the code and figure out what are some things I can strip out while still maintaining this design and making sure it looks good. Again, that goes back to my instructional design as well, on my communications background as well. They all fit together nicely.
Mhm.
Just so happen to be, with what I'm working on. So
You're lucky. Have you ever gotten pushback for all these things that you want to try to do and change?
Oh, of course. Yeah. So in a variety of areas and from a variety of people, I think that's going to happen. But one thing that has always been a challenge, I think, is trying to apply that more contemporary mindset to L&D in an organization.
Yeah.
I remember once during my time at GE when our team was working hard on creating a social community that someone actually went to our boss and told him we were spending too much time on the internal social media. And it was kind of comical because it was like they were telling on us, but it was actually our job. So it's just telling how some people's mindsets can be around that kind of thing. And of course, there are also plenty of leaders who are simply not familiar with the value proposition of taking a more informal approach to engaging employees. So in both cases, we try to address it really by your typical means, showing how efforts that we're doing support broader priorities, but also sharing how those kinds of efforts play into a larger value proposition and how to measure that.
The other key to that, I think, is tying it back to revenue. Like, people think, yeah, you can do all this stuff for your employees, but how does it really impact the bottom line of the company? Like, how do you show them that you can attribute all of this work that you're doing to the overall goals of the company?
It's interesting. I love this question, and I don't know that a lot of people are going to love the answer, because for me, I would say I don't. Not for most L&D initiatives anyway. So when I was an instructional designer, I always struggled with this, mostly due to the copious amounts of time that I spent like tracking every hour of my work. And I was just wondering, like, how is this really proving anything aside from the fact that I'm working? And in school even, they made a point to ensure that if we did a project, you could show whether you were doing something that had some kind of tangible ROI. But this is feasible for very specific types of training. So things like where there's a measurable skill deficiency that's critical for someone's job. Really categories like sales, quality, customer service, those things, I think absolutely it's important to make sure that you have a clear gap, a clear, what is the value of this thing that you're trying to fill the gap for, so you can measure that, and what is your measure, et cetera. So this isn't to downplay any of that. But there's a good chunk of other learning and development that happens where you really have to stretch to get to the level of impact as far as revenue goes. Right. And it's usually a correlation at best. So it seems like historically, those types of things have been kind of worthless to an organization. So to your point, like, if you can't tie it to revenue, why does it matter? But I think that's absolutely not the case. So yes, you do need to find out, like I said before, how is what you're doing supporting a broader organizational need? But the light bulb started to go off for me when somebody once stated how L&D is a cost center, not a profit center. So just because we say that doesn't mean that as a function, L&D isn't a business partner, or that L&D is disposable and not critical to business. But we have to get more aware and committed to the fact that there are measures other than hard revenue that are similarly important for organizational success. So I subscribe to the concept, and I've started to develop my perspectives around ROE or ROX, depending on how there is in the industry now. It's kind of acronymized a couple of different ways, either ROE or ROX, which is just return on engagement, or sometimes return on engagement and experience. So you still need money as a business, but it's so critical to see all of the other things that go into making a company work well, and that then contribute to it making money, or that prevent a company from losing money. So one of those things, just as an example, it's employees themselves. So there are plenty of studies out there. Again, the war on talent right now, we're seeing this. They cite how costly it is for an organization to have disengaged employees, or for the cost of turnover. So there is a 2021 report from LinkedIn in their workplace learning report, where they cited how learners who use social features on average watch 30 times more hours of learning content. And as a sentiment metric goes, most professionals believe that employees who learn together are more successful and they feel more engaged. It gives them a sense of belonging. So with that, there's lower turnover, and then there's also lower risk in your organization, because if you keep employees there who know your policies and procedures versus having a constant churn and people who may not be familiar with your company's policies and things like that. It's just overall, there are a lot of other things that play into that, surely business executives and shareholders should care about those things too, as far as the success of the business, because there's a lot of those things that ultimately could affect revenue, even if it's not in the way of making money. So in short, for me, it's all about the employee experience.
I agree. I like how you kind of framed it, and I look at it too. Like if your employees are learning and they're growing, they're happy and they want to stay,
Mm.
and then you, like you said, you don't have that employee turnover, and you don't have the cost of bringing in a new person, maybe at a higher rate because the jobs are in such demand, and because that all does in the end go back to bottom line as well. But yeah, I like that kind of how you kind of frame that. It's really good.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is where, just like from a metric standpoint, that's where a lot of the education happens, I think, is because a lot of people are like, well, okay, even if that's what you want to say the value is, how do you measure that? And so there's a lot of that digital engagement and thinking like almost like e-commerce. How can you apply that to your industry and your organization to start measuring those types of things?
Yeah, and marketing kind of has the same problem where we always used to be called a cost center, and now they want it to be a profit center. And there's just so many things in marketing that it's really tricky to tie back to bottom line and revenue. So it's all kind of, I think
Mhm.
every organization's facing it from different angles.
Yeah.
Okay, so you created and you hosted and you produced a podcast of your own when you worked for GE. I'm going to say this, hopefully not funny, Crotonville.
Granville, yeah.
Um, it was called Brilliance Leadership Learning. And so tell me a little bit about it, and tell me, so like, why did you create it? Why did you think that was an approach to take, and how you got buy-in for it?
Yeah. So that one was, so we had built a learning experience platform inside of GE. It was something that was completely almost just like a little entrepreneurial team that was put together, UX, UI developers. I was a product manager. And so it was, it's kind of played out now, but it was like that Netflix for learning, Amazon for learning experience that we were truly trying to create along these same lines of having that contemporary experience. GE Crotonville is really well known for their in-person, their face-to-face leadership training at that campus up in New York. So our task was, how can we extend that? Like I said before, what are people doing before? What are they doing after? Or how do we even tie in some of the stuff, resources that we have on this platform with what's going on in those programs? So we built the platform, and we had, of course, all different kinds of content. We had courses, articles, videos. And one thing that we all know is kind of coming back into popularity. I mean, this was like 10 years ago, I think, at this point, at least. It was the podcast, right? All the true crime podcasts and all these things.
Right.
So we started to think about how could we integrate that into our strategy. And so our platform was an internal only platform, so we started to import RSS feeds. But then we started thinking, well, how could we also provide content related to what we're doing and build engagement to this platform through a podcast? So it was just sort of an idea we had. And then I was lucky enough to have a manager, shout out to Sarah Lay, and Monty, who they just were very supportive of the idea and said, hey, go for it, like get some of the equipment and just kind of figure it out. So this is also like, I got with our branding teams, tried to figure out how can I make some, there's no branding guidelines internally for like podcast artwork. So
Right.
even though you can look at what they had, it wasn't really channel, or it wasn't context specific for what I was trying to do. So I just worked with them, explained it, did something that I think technically was still maybe kind of out of brand, but whatever. It still has our logo and the colors, so it's all good. It was like, you have to break some rules sometimes,
Yeah.
because nobody had the rules for that. So
Yeah.
but it was just kind of completely building from the ground up. And I spent a good 6 months on everything from like from the artwork, like what makes sense to have on artwork to catch people's eye, the name, of course, making sure that made sense, wasn't already used, that kind of thing. What was the strategy for releasing episodes? What is the very hidden secret to getting in the iTunes, like most noteworthy or new, whatever it is, section on the podcast, which must be like a very closely guarded secret because nobody knows. There's a lot of conjecture, but you don't really know.
Yeah.
So, and then it was also just getting the setup because I was working remotely. Even then, like I said, is like for at least the past 10 years, I've been doing that on a remote team. So it wasn't like I was going to be able to go in with with a recorder and meet somebody face to face on our campus and, have an interview. So I had to learn, it started out as kind of just recording from my computer. And then as best practices, it was, what if your computer crashes during the interview and you lose it all? So I got a little handheld, a digital recorder to connect into that. And then it evolved to actually having a mixer. So I could do what's called a mix minus and record both sides of the conversation through a mixer at once instead of through my computer or just the recorder. And then that would also help me do levels like introduce sound effects if I wanted to. So it was that like, I spent a while doing that until I first actually started releasing episodes, because it was one of those things where I felt like I don't know what I'm really doing. I don't know if this is legit. And I don't know if it's going to be good, but finally I was like, just do it, just start. And it's true what they say. Like once I started actually releasing things and seeing how, what the reactions were, and again, marketing it, like how am I putting out into the world and sharing it through our social media and internally, it started evolving. My audio quality got better. My editing got better. We actually sourced like the intro from just a colleague of mine that did the voiceover for us. To kind of do that intro.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was just a big learning experience, learning process, and it was super fun.
Is there a process that you go through or things that you do to kind of figure out what are kind of innovative ideas to bring to the work that you do?
I wouldn't say there's a set process for sure. I don't know. I know some creatives probably do have go off in a cabin and like think or write or something.
Yeah, retreat.
Yeah. For me, I don't like dedicate time to think. A lot of my stuff comes very organically, or just continuing to work off of existing ideas. So for me, it's more of that curiosity factor. So, okay, this is what is there today. How can I make it better? Or what is the best practice around this? And then once I learn about that, it might be, well, how can I make that more unique or add to that, or, do something differently in some way?
Yeah. Are there things that you kind of are seeing going on right now or that are looking like they're coming in the future that you think would be really cool to kind of build programs around?
Yeah. I mean, the whole topic of this podcast, right? I think I would really love to um, start making more of that bridge between contemporary consumer-like experiences and how organizations that are typically very structured, your very corporate type of structures, into something that's really more engaging for employees, just because both for the organization and for the employees who are going through all of this right now, it impacts everybody.
Right.
So having something that works better for everybody, I'm seeing a lot of conversations about work from home and whether organizations are adopting to do that full time now or not. And then, the impacts of employees and how that helps them or not, if they've been able to do that. So I think just bringing everybody back to speed, up to speed on how the world has changed at this point. There's a lot of this talk of future of work and future of HR. That's now at this point. What is the HR and the experience of now? So I think the more that people delay on that or just keep on to that control that organizations have had, they just have to everything, their talent acquisition, their talent development, overall organizational strategies. I think those all have to kind of start catching up and connecting those dots as far as what are ways of working and ways of operating that are more like these other industries that have had success reaching people when they're not physically, in a store or, face to face with somebody.
Yeah. And there's also that idea that the Zoom fatigue, people are working from home. It's going to happen more and more and more,
Mm-hmm.
but they're also kind of tired of being on the Zoom calls all day. So there's got to be other ways to kind of help them grow and learn and evolve and work together that don't require being on camera all day long.
Yeah. And, I think this is kind of funny too, because the whole time that I had worked at GE, I mean, we had some calls where we were on video, but for the most part, I actually, when I started my new role with Baker Hughes, and so for people who don't know, Baker Hughes is actually a divested oil and gas arm of GE. So GE had acquired Baker Hughes when they had their own oil and gas, and then with the kind of divestiture of several of the businesses, they divested Baker Hughes as well. Now the whole oil and gas. So, but when I formally like switched over to Baker Hughes, at that point they were pretty much operating as their completely own entity at that point. And I definitely had like the Zoom fatigue, because for the past like 9 years at that point, it wasn't a daily thing to be on camera. We would have our conferences, but we were not on video the whole time. And I do think that's probably because we had already built the relationships with each other. I mean, periodically we would travel, right, and still have in-person meetings. But we just didn't feel that need to have to see each other. I think it was a trust thing. I think there's a lot of things that go into that for sure. So I definitely agree with that. And that's another thing that I just think has to change and adapt. How important is it? I know some people are really like, oh, like, I don't feel like I'm interacting with people if you don't see them, but I just think there has to be a balance, because it definitely is hard when you're not physically like looking at people around a room, to just be like staring at your screen. And like half the time I'm like looking at myself, because I'm like, so, so anyways, it's just, yeah, it's possible. It is possible. There's, I think, the team dynamics and, again, organizational dynamics. How much do people trust that other people are actually, they're having good communication skills in general without seeing body language? Body language is huge when you're, kind of working separately. But if you already have that cohesiveness, sometimes it can be good to not have to worry about like, what face am I making if I'm thinking about what this person is saying? Cause I'm not trying to offend them, but like, so.
That's funny. Okay. Here's the second final question for you. What advice would you give if someone is up and coming in the HR employee experience kind of area of the company that really wanted to do some of the stuff that you're doing and get involved more that way? What advice would you give them to get started?
I definitely learn, like research and learn. Again, that doesn't mean you have to become the expert, but I would say do some research and then do some experiments. That is one thing about, innovation and, working really as kind of a high performing professional that I took away, from my time at GE. I do have to credit GE for that. I mean, were so well known for being that. We did a lot of cultural initiatives that were about like fast works, which was, kind of like taking the agile methodology to development, but applying it to everyday work. So, outlining your assumptions, but doing small experience, your minimum viable product, and just seeing what happens, rather than trying to spend a lot of time, making a perfect plan. And then by the time that you test that plan, you could have gotten so much more feedback if you had just kind of, gone out to your audience or gone out to your customer and ask some things. So I just think, kind of getting that baseline of, I think, process and approach, if you're up and coming, is important, because all the rest you can just do the experiment, see how it goes, and kind of evolve your own perspective from there. That's another thing that I would say is I like to learn a lot from, I wouldn't say like social media, but from communities of people. Social media can be scary sometimes. That's still valid to learn for sure. But for example, I learned a lot from a website called Quora. It's people just ask questions like, some of them are very philosophical, just about life, but some of them are like, well, how can I stay fit or something? And it's so interesting because you'll see people who say, well, don't do this, you need to do this. But then you'll see somebody else come in and be like, well, actually you can do this or this. And it just opens up like your mind to how many different ways there are to do something, or how there's not just one right answer, or how just things are different depending on the context. So sometimes, even though there are areas that are very, specific, there's rules and process and all that kind of good stuff, I always just like to see, well, how do other people approach this? And just kind of always keep an open mind. Even if I have a pretty firm perspective, I always tell people, even if I sound really committed about this, like, tell me if you think this is wrong for some reason, because I always want to understand why that is. And even if you don't end up agreeing with that, having an understanding of how others perceive things is just useful, to working with others and your influence and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know if that was really like one clear answer, but
no, I think that's great, because I think too many people would come in and go, well, you got to do A, B, C, and D, and there is no best practice to do anything. We're all kind of learning and growing and evolving in everything that we do. And so yeah, I think that was a perfect answer. So
Cool.
okay, so last question. You were worried that your dog was gonna bark. Do you have one dog or two?
I have one.
One. Her name?
Her name is Hattie Mae.
Oh, I like that. Okay. I had
Yeah.
to know about your dog because everybody has dogs, and usually you hear them once in a while in the background. So
Yeah. Well, so not to end it on a sad note, I'll make it happy, but I actually have I had two cats as well. One of them recently passed away, and so you'll see in the background of my printer, I've got a little cat bed because he would always sit up there. So we still leave that there by the plant in memory of him. But I got his picture right here. He was always on my desk, and that's usually who you would see is
oh
the
yeah, I love animals. I don't
yeah.
have any right now. I would love to, but yeah.
I know. Yeah.
Okay, well, you know what? This was really good conversation. I learned lots of new stuff. This is not an area that I work in, but I always found it fascinating and important when I work for companies that they're, thinking about their employees and kind of growing them the right way. So it was really great. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invite. Happy to be here.